Welcome back for a new collections video. This time is the PlayStation 3. So, one of the ones I've been looking forward to the most. Music today is from Tekken Tag Tournament, as you have Hybrid, of course. First up, of loose games, a couple. Ratchet and Clank, All for One. Enchanted Arms, which I also have on the 360. Great RPG. Soul Calibur 4. Dead Rising 2, Off the Record. Street Fighter Cross Tekken. Also, I have the 25th anniversary Street Fighter collection, but I kind of did not want to have to get that out right now of storage because it's pretty big, but you can look it up on YouTube. First up, of regular games, we have Sonic's Ultimate Genesis Collection. A great collection of games, a great compilation. If you're a big Sega fan, I highly recommend this, as it has over 50 Sega Genesis classics on it. I do highly recommend it if you're both a Sonic fan and you appreciate good classic games like the Phantasy Star series. Also, Journey Collector's Edition, which also includes two other games from the same developers, and Journey itself makes it worth having this. This is a great collection if you want to support indie games. Next up, have Kingdom Hearts 2.5 Remix. Next, Lego Star Wars, The Complete Saga, which is, well, at the time, which is episodes 1 through 6. Next up, Minecraft, PlayStation 3 edition, of course. And what else can I say about Minecraft other than great game? Next up, we have Ni no Kuni Wrath of the White Witch, which is a superb, somewhat underrated cult classic in my opinion, especially if you like the arts of like Studio Ghibli films. Next up, we have Sly Cooper Thieves in Time, which I've already talked about before, as I feel it's a criminally underrated game. Next up, this is the special version you got for pre-order in advance, with a little art book also included, but this is of course Kingdom Hearts 1.5 Remix. And along with that also, when I pre-ordered in advance, Final Fantasy X and X-2 HD Remaster Collection, which is great, and I love the little art book included with it. Next up, we have Ashura's Wrath, as I've said before. This game is great. It is truly a ultimate great gem if you like over-the-top, insane action games. You can't go more over-the-top than this superb game, which more people honestly need to check out Ashura's Wrath, in my opinion. Also, a great game if you like Dynasty Warrior style games, and you're a fan of the great series Bleach. I highly recommend checking out Bleach Soul Resurrection, which is great over the top, and the soundtrack is great as well, as long as you're into hard rock and metal. Of course, the classic Batman Arkham Asylum. I can't say much other than best of the Arkham series. Next up, of course, a game I've talked about more than once, as I feel this is a underrated gem of the 7th generation. I think, frankly, Arkham Origins deserves more love than it gets. And next up we have Blaze Blue Continuum Shift. If you've never actually tried out the Blaze Blue series, I do highly recommend it. It's a great anime fighter from Arc System Works. Next up, we have Final Fantasy XIII, a definitely polarizing title in the series to say the least. Then, in my opinion, the best, 13-2. Overall quality of the story and characters I just prefer in 13-2. Then there's the also somewhat controversial third installment, Lightning Returns. Which, yeah, if you got this, you also got special DLC costume and Blade. This game I have very mixed opinions on, as it does have a time element system in it that kind of reminds me a little of Majora's Mask, except Majora's Mask is actually way more interesting, story-wise. Next up you have, of course, the original launch version of Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn, which would become much more successful than its predecessor, 11. Of course, later on, another release, Heaven's Sword. Probably the first and about only MMO game I've genuinely actually enjoyed is probably 14. Well, besides, I actually did like 11 when it came out, to be fair. Also, of course, Injustice Gods Among Us. A great fighter that needs no real introduction, as it is a superb fighting game. And of course, this is the ultimate version with the DLC included. Next, we have the base version of Marvel vs. Capcom 2, The Fate of Two Worlds. Absolutely love the steelbook. Of course, the cult classic, Mirror's Edge. Then we have the overhated, in my opinion, Mortal Kombat vs. DC Universe. Admittedly, maybe I partially defend also this game just because I like the fact, find it interesting having DC characters going at it with MK characters. It's just rather entertaining to me, personally. Plus, this is really where you get the trademark future story mode and stuff for its origins came from this game specifically. Then you also have the underrated PlayStation All-Stars, which I still say more people need to give this game a chance than it's actually been given. And it is kind of awesome. Also, you have, of course, characters like Parappa the Rapper. I think it's pretty cool. Also, the attempted Prince of Persia reboot, which I also feel gets a little too much hate. I actually liked the art style overall they went with the attempted reboot, and I thought it was interesting. I mean, nothing will probably ever outdo Prince of Persia Sands of Time, but still, it's probably my second favorite Prince of Persia game in all honesty. Also, a somewhat interesting, unique attempt at like a reboot of the original PS1 classic, Starhawk. You have this, which is kind of unusual, but the crazy thing is, people still on occasion play this game online to this day on PS3, believe it or not. But then again, that's because PS3, PSN is free, which is why you'll still find people online playing some of these games, which is actually pretty cool. So if you thought about getting this, you can get dirt cheap, and also there's still occasionally people actually play this online. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. Also, of course, have the great Star Wars The Force Unleashed, the Sith edition. I love that suit and design. And of course, the introduction of Star Killer. Also, the original classic vanilla version Street Fighter 4 back when Sagat was insanely broken. Maybe it's one of the reasons I liked playing Sagat in vanilla. And funny thing is, you can actually still play vanilla. Like, if you have the 360 version, you can actually play things to backwards compatibility on Xbox One and Series X. Also, you have, of course, my personal favorite version, Super Street Fighter 4 Arcade Edition, which also I think has by far the best cover art out of the versions. And of course also added in this version, Evil Ryu and Oni. Though it's insane trying to fight Oni, all the requirements absurd. Then we have, of course, I have the music playing from the background. Tekken Hybrid, which has the full HD version of Tekken Tag Tournament 1 with the animated film Blood Vengeance, and also a prologue demo of, at the time, Tekken Tag Tournament 2. Which is pretty cool. And I actually say this is the best way to play Tekken Tag Tournament, the original. This is one of the good things about the PS3 is having stuff like this. Also, of course, Tekken Tag Tournament 2. This is the reverse cover that is provided with the game, and I personally like the reverse cover more than the original. And then we have the great HD collection, Ico and Shadow of the Colossus. Remastered. Shadow of the Colossus is lucky. It actually got a full, remake, while Ico seems to get ignored. Even though I technically like probably Ico a little more overall, I just like the puzzles and everything in it more. Next up, we have Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3, which really needs no introduction, and of course my favorite of the series as a whole. And I love also that cover art. Also, Ultra Street Fighter 4, which you can actually get at least on PS4 and everything, which is great. It is by far, of course, the most complete version and best way overall to play 4. Then we have the overlooked and underappreciated Under Night in Birth. Probably, in my opinion, is pretty much tied as my favorite Arc System Works fighter. Also, of course, the original classic, Uncharted. It's cool occasionally going back and seeing where this franchise actually started. Then we have my favorite of the trilogy, Uncharted 2, Among Thieves, is my personal favorite. Besides also Golden Abyss. And of course, the very cinematic Uncharted 3, which I'd say is probably quite a few people's favorites in the series. Next up, we have, of course, as I've already talked about before in a recent top 10 underrated list, Alice Madness Returns, as it's actually quite depth. There's actually quite a bit of psychological study and everything that's actually done in this story. There are some questionable things at times with the story and things, but I think overall it definitely gives a very unique experience you're not going to get pretty much in any other game really of this generation specifically. It's definitely one of the most unique experiences you can have of the 7th generation. Then we have one of my, of course, my personal favorite Assassin's Creed game with Assassin's Creed 3, as I like the time period when this actually is supposed to take place. And if you don't have, I highly recommend getting the remaster of this, which also includes Assassin's Creed 3 Liberation. Also, another one of my personal favorite Assassin's Creed games, Rogue, which I've actually had this since day one of its original launch. I had this pre-ordered in advance because I hadn't had a PS4 yet when Unity and this came out. Now, funny enough, like Rogue I would probably have in my top 5 favorite AC games, and I think Unity gets personally a little too much hate. But yeah, Rogue's reason is because the unique stuff it does in the story is why I love this game specifically so much. Also, the not-so-great Colonial Marines Aliens game done by Gearbox. Now, the game itself, I mean, it's not a bad game overall. The problem is the computer AI, unfortunately, is not very good, and that's to say it mildly. I mean, it's not as bad nowadays, thanks to a lot of patch updates, but it still has definitely some issues here and there, but it is great to play if you want a good laugh, in my opinion. That's the main reason I played the game, was just to get a good laugh. Then we have an interesting game, to say the least, of course, Beyond Two Souls, which of course is made by the same people that also did Heavy Rain and of course Detroit Become Human. Now, out of these three games, my personal favorite is kind of a toss-up, I would say between this, Beyond Two Souls, and Detroit Become Human. Heavy Rain is my least favorite of the three. Though I actually really enjoyed Detroit Become Human more than a lot of people did. Next, we have, of course, Borderlands, the pre-sequel, which was actually my first Borderlands game. Well, I should say on regular console. My first time playing, and only time playing Borderlands 2 was on the Vita. But pre-sequel is actually very interesting, to say the least. I still have yet to actually play Borderlands 3 or Tales from Borderlands. Next, a game I've already showed in my 360. I actually like this game quite a bit, compared to some people out there. And you can still find occasionally people still playing this game online. Not nearly as many people as some other games, like Warhawk, but still, there's people on occasion still playing this online, which is kind of cool. Next up, we have Darksiders 2, which is arguably my favorite of the Darksiders games. Though, at least of the traditional Darksiders. Darksiders Genesis is a very unique experience, but I think the main reason I like Darksiders 2 is just the main character you play as. I like his design. I know people who are not a fan of, like, over-the-top edgelords are not going to like this, because, let's be honest, the main character is an obvious edgelord. But I like his design, and I think the gameplay is quite fun. Next, we have the original vanilla version of Dead or Alive 5, which I did get this day one, launch day. And this is pretty much up there as my favorite DOA game. I would say it's between Dead or Alive 5 and Dead or Alive 3 are probably my top two favorite DOA games. Though I actually have DOA 6 up there pretty high. And I actually think this is my favorite cover art out of the versions of 5. Next up, we have the original classic Dead Space. And yes, I did buy this actually for like $9.99. This was one of the games being sold when Blockbuster, one of the two Blockbusters we had where I live, closed. And this is one of the games I got from them when they were closing. So yeah, I do actually have Definitely some nostalgia for Dead Space, though Dead Space 2 is my personal favorite still. Original Dead Space is classic. And of course also Dead Space 3, which is an interesting game in its own right. It's definitely more action-based oriented, unlike Dead Space 1 and 2. Dead Space 1 really keeps you on edge, but I think Dead Space 2 also does a good job. Not quite so much in 3, but I think combat in 3 is actually not half bad, in all honesty. Next up, we have, of course, the classic Demon Souls. Really to start the actual Souls series, at least in name, though many others would be involved, and yeah, it's interesting in fact you have Atlas name on this. Though, of course, it's from Software. But yeah, it was From Software along with Atlas would release this game. And of course, the Dark Souls series would involve, obviously, Namco Bandai for publishing. But still a classic, though. It's definitely compared to, like, Dark Souls 2 and 3. It's definitely very inferior. And to be fair, I think Dark Souls 1 is much more better, definitely in some areas, but there's a certain charm to the original Demon Souls. Next up, Diablo 3, Reaper of Souls. Which actually is the only way I have played Diablo 3 has been on the PS3. I do need to eventually get around to actually replaying some of Diablo 3, but on PS4. But this is definitely a great experience, and I absolutely love that cover art. Looks great. Next up we have, I think, a somewhat overlooked game with Dishonored. Great first-person viewpoint game. If you like steampunk type worlds, this is actually some you might enjoy. Personally, I'm a bigger steampunk than cyberpunk person. Also, of course, you have the classic Ultimate God of War Saga Collection, which includes 1, 2, and 3, and it technically is supposed to include, like, digital versions of the others. Unfortunately, which, since I bought this pre-owned, did not include the digital games, unfortunately. So, I had to go and pick this up, Origins Collection, in order to be able to play Chains of Olympus and Ghosts of Sparta, which are great, don't get me wrong, PSP games, better than some people I think really appreciate. Personally, I actually enjoy these games quite a bit. Specifically, I like definitely elements of Chains of Olympus a little bit more, but there's also elements in Ghosts of Sparta I also appreciate. Next up we have, of course, the Killzone Trilogy, which is definitely great. If you are a fan of this series, I do highly recommend this collection. It is starting to go up in price, but still not insanely expensive yet. You can still occasionally find this very reasonable, so I say take advantage and get this game while you still can for a decent price range. Next up we have, of course, Lost Planet 2. I still need to get Lost Planet 3. Now, I've actually ended up playing the PS3 version more than this, or I ended up playing the 360 version more of this than this version. Even though it's still a great game, I personally like the first one the most. Also, of course, the all-time great Fallout New Vegas. Arguably the best of the Fallout series. At least, in my personal opinion, anyways. Next up, of course, the great Far Cry 3, which is arguably probably the best overall game, though I kind of have a certain fondness for Far Cry 4, personally. But yeah, definitely you remember this one specific bad guy on the cover. He's definitely probably the most memorable villain in the series. Then you have another game I've talked about before. It doesn't get quite as much love as it should, done by Insomniac Games with Fuse, which is an interesting FPS experience. And you would still occasionally find some people playing this online. Sadly, not as much as some of the other games. Next up, we have Metal Gear Rising, which is arguably, even though it's not a Metal Gear Solid game, I actually like this probably more than most of the Metal Gear Solid games, in all honesty. It's just a blast. It's probably one of like complete crazy action games. It's probably in my top 5 favorite action games of all time. It's just that great, over the top with all the giant robots and everything. What's not to love? And though if you're a big Metal Gear fan, you could appreciate this collection, the Metal Gear Solid Legacy Collection, which includes the original classic Metal Gear, Metal Gear 2, as well as Metal Gear Solid VR missions as well, 2 Sons of Liberty, 3 Snake Eater, 4, as well as Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, and other PSP games. So this is quite the collection for any Metal Gear Solid fan. Of course, the reboot with some interesting new addition characters added in this version. Definitely an interesting experience to say the least. Then you have, of course, the great Ninja Gaiden Sigma. Just a sort of remastered version of Ninja Gaiden 1. I still have a fondness for the original Xbox version, but usually I'd probably end up choosing to play this version just because I think it performs overall better. And another game I think that gets maybe a little too much hate is Ninja Gaiden 3. I do find interesting how this character specifically kind of reminds me of Jack of Blades from Fable 1. Then you have another game which I've talked about before with Remember Me, a superb game that deserves a lot more love than it gets from Capcom, taking place in Neo Paris. Into the final stretch now, we have Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor, which ended up, I think, blowing a lot of people away. We're not expecting this game to be as legit good as it ended up being. A great experience if you're a big fan of Tolkien's Middle-earth universe. Basically, for Tolkien fans, this is like the equivalent to or rather Middle-earth fans, this is great for, just like Hogwarts Legacy for Wizarding World fans. Then we have the somewhat, I have feeling, Silent Hill Homecoming, which is personally not insanely bad, but I do think it's by far one of the weakest games in the series, at least for me personally, though I do like some of the bosses in the game. Then you will have, of course, a game that I continue defending, Silent Hill Downpour, as I think this game is legitimately overhated by a lot of people. Unjustly, I might add. Then, of course, you have The Darkness 2. A great game, especially for any of you Top Cow comic fans out there like myself. Fans of Spawn probably also appreciate Witchblade and, of course, The Darkness. Which, frankly, I would love to see a movie in this universe, but it would absolutely have to be rated R. And, of course, the classic, many people's favorites of the Elder Scrolls series, Oblivion, My personal favorite is Morrowind, but then, of course, there's a humongous amount of people that prefer Skyrim. But to me, Oblivion is a solid, great game overall. Though Morrowind is my favorite. But with that said, still, as time has gone, I've come to appreciate Oblivion more than I used to. Of course, the classic original, The Last of Us. Definitely a benchmark, at least in the area of storytelling. That's where this game really excels, is in the story and world building. And one of the more interesting takes on a zombie apocalypse world. A somewhat also, in my opinion, overhated game, Thief. Of course, by Square Enix. It's not great compared to other Thief games, but still, for what it is, it's not that bad. Of the regular games, last we have Zone of the Enders HD Collection. Now that we're towards the end, I got a couple of imports to show, but first, a special collector's edition of Soul Calibur 5, which actually comes like it's an actual book. Even comes out the same way, which I think is actually really cool. And, oh great, that's loose, but that is the soundtrack. Well, I should say that is the making DVD, and then the actual soundtrack comes in this cool little art book at the very end, and then underneath that is the actual game itself. Soul Calibur 5 may not be one of the best games in the Soul series, at least this Soul series, but I think it definitely has one of easily my favorite collector's editions, personally. Now we have a few imports that I've gone over time. Of course, first we have a Blaze Blue game. I picked this up just because I found it dirt cheap. Next we have also JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, which has gotten re-released multiple times. And an interesting name that got an American, but I picked this up only because I found it for $1. Definitely an interesting collection of characters from many different game universes. I just appreciate the fact that Dimitri is in it. Then, if you're a big fan of giant battling robots, this is actually a pretty cool game. If you're like a Gundam fan, because this is like a 3v3 game. And it's actually a pretty fun blast to play. Second to last, a really cool spin-off game of the Lost Planet series, but this only got released on the PS3 and the 3DS, but Japan only released, so you had to import this like me. And it's actually quite fun, even if you can't read text. There are fan translations, keep in mind. But it's fun, and I love the whole anime aesthetic to it. Actually makes it pretty cool, and it plays at a solid 60 frames per second, at least on the PS3. 3DS, I have no clue how it runs. And last, like I said years back, I wanted badly the Darkstalkers collection. I want physical. I couldn't find a physical version of Darkstalker Resurrection, so I just imported Vampire Resurrection. As of the time when I picked this up, it was like $10 new. So I was like, yeah, I'll pay it. And it's definitely worth that, though I ended up paying more for shipping than the game itself. Still, I love this cover art right here. It's awesome. But with that said, that is this time for the PS3 edition. Stay tuned in the future for the Xbox One. I'll see y'all next time. Same YouTube time, same YouTube channel. Stay safe out there.